Hello and welcome to ATG the podcast, and I'm very pleased to be talking today to Josh Cromwell, the author of a forthcoming book, Institutional Repositories, in the Charleston Briefings series. Hi, Josh.
Hi, how are you?
Very good, thanks, and many thanks for sort of giving us the time to talk today. So, Josh,
Sure, happy to do it.
I thought we'd talk a little bit about start with your background and sort of how you got to be where you are. So, you're based at University of Southern Mississippi. Are you from that area?
I am, yeah. I'm originally from the general area, I guess you could say. My first role with the libraries was actually, well, I've worked with repositories since I've been at the libraries, but the initial job that I sort of applied for and got started here was actually a reference position. But this was right at the time that the university was getting ready to launch the repository. So the idea was that my position would be mostly reference with a little bit of repository sprinkled in. But then that pretty quickly transitioned once I got here and got the ball rolling, so to speak.
So it's quite accidental, your involvement with the repositories.
Yeah, it really was. So, I mean, because in fact, when I was going through that interview process, I at that point did not even know what a repository was in that capacity. So,
goodness me! So starting from scratch, that's pretty good. And the repository was just starting, so presumably nobody had much of an idea about what was involved, and how many people did they have at the beginning?
So when I came on board, they had just probably within the last year or so hired an associate dean who had worked with a repository at previous institutions. So I think one of the ideas behind her coming here was to kind of spearhead that process of launching a repository here. So she had some background. The rest of us really did not. But yeah, so that was kind of the idea there. So I missed the initial planning phase, I guess you could say, kind of the process of selecting platform, all of that business. Because I started in November of 2011, and then we launched in January of 12. So I did get in on the ground floor of the actual implementation, the rollout, the promoting it to campus, building it out, that sort of thing.
So that's pretty simple. So you didn't have to make any decisions. You just sort of carried it out and then sort of and saw what worked.
Right.
Very good. So let's go back a little bit before. So why join the library in the first place? What was the appeal of libraries?
So I've always really just enjoyed education in general. That's something I've always kind of been passionate about. And libraries kind of merged two of my interests, and that kind of goes back a bit to that reference piece, is that it was a chance to kind of do both education and research, because my background prior to that was in history. So lots of both of those, lots of time in libraries. And so that kind of developed those passions. And so once this opportunity presented itself as a way to kind of merge both of those worlds, that very much grabbed my attention.
So you got involved in repositories pretty rapidly, but this is now so you've been involved with the repository from the beginning up until sort of the present day. So that must be what, a good sort of 14, 15 years?
Yeah, going on that this November will be 15 years. Yeah. So.
And your role at the beginning of the repository, you were sort of uploading content or what?
Yeah, at the beginning, mostly that, just kind of doing some uploading, doing a little bit of promotion, kind of working with faculty, that sort of thing. But yeah, a lot of the more nuts and bolts day-to-day operations at that point.
So over time, what's changed is that you've got more involved. I see that you've been involved in training. You've published. This is not your first book about repositories, and you've also set up a conference. So how did you move from being just a sort of one of the workers to starting to sort of disseminate and look at the whole world of repositories?
Sure. So in 2013, I guess July of 2013, I became the full administrator of the repository. That associate dean that I talked about moved on to another position. So at that point, I bumped up to the administrator role. And then in 2014, ACRL hosted their Scholarly Communications Roadshow at University of Mississippi in Oxford. So I attended that. And at one point during that workshop, which of course was Scalcom writ large, so it's a lot more than just repositories, but there was one chunk in the schedule where they'd sort of left it open-ended and said, here's a list of possible topics. Which of these would you like to know more about? And the one that won the overwhelming audience vote was repositories. And kind of looking around that room and kind of hearing some of the different stories, I realized, oh, we're pretty much the only institution here that has an IR at this point, that has some background. Why aren't we sort of leveraging what we know to kind of provide some training for these other institutions that are very much interested in the same topic, looking to get their own IRs going and kind of build from that. So that was the idea. So that happened in summer of 2014. So our first IR day was in, we called it back then, was in 2015. And it was just kind of geared toward other institutions in the state to say, hey, a lot of you expressed that you're interested in doing this. We've been doing it for a little while now. We're still fairly new, but we've at least got some experience, know a little bit about that. What if we brought some folks in for us to kind of learn from, but also for you to learn from, shared some of our expertise, some of our experience, and kind of help you as you progress down that road. And it just sort of has organically grown from there.
How many people did you get in the first year?
I think the first year we had maybe 10 to 15, so pretty small. Like I said, it was a pretty small group and pretty much just in state. So
That's pretty good. And right from the beginning, you said it sounds like you're happy to sort of to learn as well as impart. So the idea wasn't just to sort of tell others what you did, but to learn from what others were doing.
yeah, absolutely. Like I said, at that point, we're what, 3 years in, so we're still pretty new to the game as well. So the first one we did, the keynote speaker we brought in was Marilyn Billings from UMass Amherst, who had been, even at that point, was one of the sort of, I guess, leading folks in IRs in the U.S. at that time. I mean, she had lots of experience, lots of knowledge, so we learned a ton from her, just as the attendees did. So that was one of the ideas. Is we're not saying, hey, we figured this all out, come learn from us. It's, hey, we're still learning too. As we learn, come benefit from that as well.
So thinking about the background to IRs, as far as I can gather, the kind of the principle of IRs was established around the time that open access was founded, because when people talked about Peter Suber in his book Open Access talked about the need to have open access articles made available, but that was around sort of 2000, 2002, 2003 when open access started. So when did repositories really get going?
I would say for at least our area, probably about a decade later is where we really started seeing repositories start popping up pretty frequently. So most of the ones for the institution, at least in my general area that I know of, were in the 20 teens, I would say. So like I said, we were 2012. I know of several of the other institutions around were in the 2015, 16-ish range. But there are still to this day new repositories popping up. So one of the side projects, I guess, that I have is that I teach an IRS course for ALA Core, and routinely we'll have students there who will be taking the course because they'll say our institution's getting ready to launch a repository for the first time, and we're just trying to kind of see what we can learn about them.
Fascinating. So, but the thing is, I mean, broadly speaking, most institutions will have a repository today. Don't you agree?
Right, yes, but at this point, most institutions have them. Most of those exceptions that I've run across are smaller institutions that are still kind of, maybe don't have the resources available, and so therefore a little later to the game than some of the bigger schools, I guess you could say.
Absolutely. So this is one of the interesting things about repositories. They all started around what, sort of 15 years ago, and today they're kind of ubiquitous, not just in the States but around the world. So what do you think is been the reason for such a sort of dramatic change, a dramatic shift in sort of library strategy?
I think there's a couple of different levels to it that I would point to. I mean, I think for one thing, I think the reason you've seen the growth kind of take off the way it is I think that it took some of the proof of concept from some of those early institutions to kind of develop them, get them going, and for people to understand, oh, this is a feasible thing. In terms of some of the philosophy underpinning it, I think it's just that same issue that we've all dealt with for years and years, which is that getting access to research, especially when it's behind paywalls, just has become financially unsustainable. And so if there's other ways that we can get access, or in the institution standpoint, provide access to make that content that we as an institution are generating, make that scholarship available, and make sure that people can actually read it, use it, incorporate their own research, then that expands the institution's profile, right? It's a way for people to actually see what researchers are doing to benefit from that research in a way they can't if all of that knowledge is chucked behind a paywall that they can't access for financial or other related reasons.
So do you think it's true to say the repositories have fulfilled their intended purpose?
Yes and no, I would say. So if you're looking back at sort of the initial promise of repositories, where the idea was that they're going to become these sort of complete collections of all of the scholarly output of institution and kind of have all of that ready and freely available. Certainly, they've not fully achieved that goal. I mean, obviously, because of the various, you've got copyright things to navigate and all the different considerations there. But in terms of really showcasing what the institution can do, and really, I would say expanding beyond that initial vision to now the fact that repositories are including things like theses and dissertations or other research outputs, gray literature, for example, that wouldn't fit in some of the traditional publishing profiles, but still has a lot of scholarly and academic import. I would say in that regard, they've very much achieved the goal because they've become a home for valuable research, valuable scholarship that wouldn't have a home elsewhere, that wouldn't fit the profile of some of these other outlets, and therefore has made that available. So yes and no. No, if you're going back to just that initial vision, I guess, but yes, if you realize that I think over time we've realized that that vision could be a lot broader and more expansive, and the repositories have very much succeeded in meeting some of those needs.
That seems to be one of the differences between sort of national styles, if you like, because the way that repositories are developed in the States, as you say, with lots of grey literature, lots of sort of stuff that isn't captured anywhere else, whereas in other countries sometimes you get sort of more of an insistence on all the green OA access, the green OA articles. Sure. Do you think there's a sort of a lesson there for different countries?
Definitely so. I think if the focus is just kind of on the green OA, I mean, what I would say is it's a both and situation. It's not either or. Like, I don't think that it has to be one approach or the other. I think it's a both and. Like, I think that there are ways in the States that we could do a better job with green OA, and I think that perhaps there are ways that internationally the repository could be used more expansively than just maybe some of the green OA focus. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's actually talk about the book, because I think one of the things that interested me about your book is that you don't kind of mince your words in sort of describing sort of about repositories and how they've what worked and what doesn't work. So, why did you do the book in the first place?
So really, it was just I'd written, or I'd edited, I guess I should say, the book for ACRL a couple of years ago. Called Rethinking Institutional Repositories, and that was kind of a collection of vignettes from different repository managers about some of the different projects and use cases they had done. Kind of going back to what I mentioned before, right? That notion of finding more expansive ways to use the repository to showcase and make available collections that maybe we hadn't really thought about before. But so this book was a way to kind of really approach IRs from two standpoints, both kind of the fundamentals, some of the basics of IR, some of the different considerations that go into building and growing the IR, again, kind of leveraging some of that experience of doing this for a while, but then also trying to look a little bit at that global context and thinking about, okay, 20 years in from really kind of where IR started, where are we now and where maybe could we be headed? How can we move toward a future that makes the IR even better than it is to this point? So that's kind of the idea, I guess, is kind of look at both the local picture, kind of individual IR picture, like what goes into building one out. So as a resource for folks who maybe are new to the space, like most of us that I've talked to, including myself, like we talked about before, I didn't come into this role that I'm in now knowing anything about IRs. I kind of had to learn it as I went. And hosting SMRC for several years, I've talked to many, many people who have kind of come into the repository space almost kind of accidentally, sort of those same ways. It's, hey, the institution decided we need to have one, and they didn't really know who to do it, so it fell to me to do this, and I had to kind of learn as I went. So this is a goal for this to be a resource for people in that similar position to have a good foundation for, okay, you've been tapped for this role now, you may not know a lot about it. What goes into an IR? What are sort of the essentials that you need to know? And then kind of from that point, for the more experienced IR manager, you get into some of the considerations like preservation or accessibility, or then kind of looking at how do we network these IRs globally? How do we make them play nicely together? How do we build these open systems that work better on that larger scale? And so that's kind of the second half of the book.
So from all your experience, both as a trainer and running courses and as a published author, what do you think has surprised you most from the feedback you get from people you present to?
Probably the thing that I was just saying, the number of people who have kind of ended up in this space almost by accident, I guess you could say, that didn't really start out down this role and who have kind of had to learn this themselves. I mean, like I said, that's kind of been the driving thing that's led me toward a lot of this. It's just kind of discovering, oh, I'm not the only one who has this story. A lot of us have very similar variations of the same story where we didn't go into this with a lot of advanced training or knowledge. It's just, here you are, figure it out, go from here. And so just kind of hearing how many people had similar stories, but then once they got into that work, have really seen the value of an IR and have really kind of grown to enjoy and love that work and buy into the potential that exists with IRs, I think has been, very encouraging to see.
Mm. The Smoke conference, I believe, is that free to attend? Is it?
It is, yes.
And not only that, which you've been running for more than 10 years, but this book is published open access. This involves a lot of time and effort for you. So why do you do it?
The book as a whole, or the open access bit?
Yeah, why get involved? I mean, for you as an author and as a trainer, that's a lot of time and energy that you have to put into, running a repository. At least you get paid for it. But all the training and the talking to people and producing the book is sort of is something you do sort of off your own bat, as it were. So that's a lot of effort.
Sure, yeah. A lot of it just stems from, part of it's going back to what I mentioned before, just my own sort of background and enjoyment of education. So I enjoy teaching. I enjoy that side of the process of academia just in general anyway. But it's also having heard those stories, having heard how many people were kind of in my experience, being able to hopefully alleviate some of that from them, to give them some skills, to give them some of my experiences or things from other people as well, right? I mean, going back to the first book, there's a lot of voices in that besides just me. I don't want to pretend like I'm the one who's figured all of this out. I'm just one perspective amongst many, but to take all of those voices from other peers and colleagues and be able to share that with others and to hopefully make that transition into the world of repositories a little easier maybe than it was for some of us who had to just kind of figured out as we went is one of the big motivators I would point to in terms of why I've wanted to do that. It's just to kind of help the next, I guess, generation of IR manager along so that they're not having to learn the hard way the way many of us did.
Well, one of the things you say in your book is the kind of provocative statement. You say institutional repositories are central, but they're underutilized. So what do you mean by that?
I still think that, at least in my experience, and I think in the experience of others we've talked to, I still think that a lot of faculty don't fully understand what an IR is or fully understand the value it can bring to them. And a lot of that just comes down to the nature of that in most institutions, you've got very small teams working on IRs. And when you've got the nuts and bolts day-to-day things that have to get done, and then there's also the bit of trying to get the word out to everybody, it can become difficult to accomplish all of that. And so I don't think that in a lot of cases, especially when you're dealing with small teams that have a lot of work to do, that the messaging really fully gets out to faculty or to the campus community as a whole about just what the IR is and all the things that it can do to kind of enhance and showcase their research.
Certainly seems that repositories are a bit of a well-kept secret in that not many people know about them outside the ones who actually work on it. How many people did you have in your team at Southern Mississippi?
So currently there are two of us. There's myself and then my colleague Jenny, who is the institutional repository coordinator.
What do you think is the future repository? Do you think you mentioned you talk about a term greenaissance?
Right.
What do you mean behind that?
I mean that I see potentially the chance for a real resurgence, or perhaps even greater than it was before, in the use of repositories in general, but including institutional repositories, just with some of the changing landscape of scholarly publishing right now. I think that one of the things that a lot of institutions that are discovering is that a lot of the initial promise of Gold OA has not fully lived up to its potential because of the fact that in a lot of cases all that's happened really is price shifting. It's still kind of that same unsustainable cost that you saw in the big deal models where universities are paying large sums to get access to all these subscription journal packages. Now it's kind of that same process, except now instead of paying for subscriptions, they're paying for APCs. And so a lot of that's kind of becoming less sustainable. I think you're seeing more and more grants or funding agencies say we're not going to pay for those APCs. You're seeing that with federal policy in the US. You're seeing that with things like Plan S. And so all of a sudden, if researchers don't have the finances to pay some of those large fees, then they've got to find other ways to comply with the mandates to make their scholarship open. In which case, I see the potential for repositories to stand here and raise their hands and say, hey, we're over here. We've been doing this for a while. We can do this now as well. And there's no fee associated with us. So come talk to us and let us help you with that. I see some real potential, especially as some of those fees become more and more, I guess, onerous or difficult to fund. And as funders are more and more are less and less inclined to say, hey, we're not going to fit the bill for that, then I think there's some real opportunity for repositories to leverage that to help researchers comply with those mandates in a way that's far more financially sustainable than the APC model.
So you think IRs could benefit from a bit of a PR campaign?
Right, absolutely.
sounds very good. And what about AI? Do you think the amazing advances in AI over the last few years, particularly Gen AI, do you think that makes a difference to the way a repository should run?
For me, I think the biggest potential for AI with repositories is for some of those day-to-day tasks that I was talking about before. So especially some of the more, I guess, repetitive tasks. So I could see potentially AI being helpful for things like metadata, for example. I could see it maybe for even some design of site design or building out IR platforms. So like the coding side, that area. That to me, I think could have some real potential because I think that gets back into what I was talking about before, right? The issue of small teams with a lot of workload. If we're able to offload some of those more repetitive tasks that don't require high complexity to AI, then that frees up more of the staff or things like some of the outreach that I talked about before, or some of the planning or the top level things to kind of help with networking IRs or making sure they're interoperable, those sorts of things that I've mentioned before. So that's where I would see the real potential maybe existing, is to kind of offload some of those tasks. Accessibility, another one, right? There's a potential for AIs to help with things like transcribing audio for, say, lectures or recordings that are in the IR, or even potentially doing alt text for images or things of that nature that require a lot of manpower at this point to do. If you're able to offload some of that and then kind of dedicate your manpower to more of the outreach, more of the promotion, more of the really maximizing the IR's potential, I think that could potentially be a very helpful thing.
But one of the things I've noticed from talking to lots of repository managers is, as you say, the sort of the amazing amount of manual labour involved in actually sort of getting individual articles into the system and tagging them, adding the metadata, and so on. Don't you think that one of the challenges is that trying to find a technical solution requires skills that perhaps the sort of repository managers themselves are unlikely to have?
Sure, absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest barriers you come across. Or if someone does have those skills, then more often than not, they can find much higher paying jobs to use those skills outside of academia, right? So finding somebody that both has the skills and the passion for the work, that is willing to kind of accept that, hey, you're not gonna make a fortune doing this work like you could in some other industries, and to buy into that becomes hard to find. It's kind of almost looking for a unicorn sometimes to find that merger of skill sets.
One of the things about that perhaps surprisingly has brought repositories into sort of higher prominence with Gen AI. I noticed from the recent Open Repositories conference, many of the speakers were talking about the issue of their collection being scraped and having problems with access of getting the sort of the content. And don't you think this is a sort of a fundamental issue with repositories, in that they were set up to make content available? And yet,
Right.
here's content being accessed, and they didn't always like it.
Sure. But I guess my pushback at the same time would be to say that a lot of that content, especially if you're dealing with published articles, most of the large publishers at this point have signed agreements with some of these different AI companies to allow their content to be scraped that way. So it's happening one way or the other, whether it's happening through the IR or not. Now, I do think there are some considerations to take with regard to AI and the IR for a couple different things. Number one, I've heard instances of institutions who have basically had their platform being taken down for a point just because the scrapers have basically, the traffic has overwhelmed the site. So obviously that's a concern. There needs to be some ways to kind of manage some of that. And I think the other thing is to at least kind of understand where the traffic is coming from, because so much of the reporting around IRs looks at things like your download counts, your visits, or statistics, that kind of thing. And so obviously if those numbers are being heavily inflated by AI, then that's something we want to be able to identify, so we can kind of see what's our usage like in terms of actual human beings versus bots. But yeah, so yes, there's some concerns there and some things that I think we need to consider and think about how to address. But at the same time, I think some of those concerns are far more fundamental in the system beyond just the IR itself. If your concern is, hey, the AI is, these AI platforms are accessing my work, chances are if you published it, they already are.
Isn't that doesn't this whole issue of Gen AI scraping content raise the sort of perhaps even paradoxically the sort of fundamental purpose of the AI, which is to make content available? And one of the things that you raise in your book is the need for, of course, individual repositories themselves are not going to get huge amounts of traffic, but it's vital that they make content available. So the need, in a way, the creation of LLMs is exactly what institutional repositories were designed for.
Yeah, I mean, in a real sense, yes, because it's all built on that idea of making content available, right? And there's a sense in which, I mean, if one of the issues that I think we come across quite a bit with Gen AI is the risk of lots of still a decent amount of inaccurate information. Isn't it better for those AIs, if they're going to be used in that way, and we can have bigger conversations about kind of the uses of Gen AI and that sort of thing. But if they're going to be used by people to find information, isn't it better that they're being trained on solid scholarly research as opposed to just the wild west of whatever's out there on the internet that could get into all sorts of unfounded theories or ideas or what have you, right? Isn't it better that they're at least getting access to some sound, peer-reviewed, tested scholarship to hopefully provide more accurate information to users?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I remember going to a conference where an academic said, in the space of a few minutes, she wanted access to all the world's scholarly content, but she didn't want her own articles to be available. It seemed a bit sort of perverse. So
I do hear a lot of that, or I won't say a lot, but I do hear a decent amount of that sort of open for thee but not for me idea.
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, I want access to all your stuff, but no, mine needs to be behind this wall because of whatever, Yeah.
What have you got on your next plans?
So one of the things that I'm looking at right now, and it kind of, I guess, stems back again to that education piece, is I'm looking at the state of IR and really Scholcom as a whole, scholarly communication, education, I guess. One of the things I'm trying to do currently is kind of explore what sorts of courses are out there for, say, library science students. Are they getting that background in their educational programs now? Or is it more things like the course I'm doing for ALA or events like SMERG or Open Repositories, where they're going to be able to find that knowledge? Like, how has the educational side of the profession, or how have they not met that need for training in IRs or in scholarly communications for the upcoming, for the librarians of the future, basically? Are they getting that education or not? And if not, what are some ways to address that?
How much training did you get on repositories in your own library training?
Not a great deal. In fact, quite frankly, most of the time, whenever some of the classes here are covering IRs, they'll bring me in as a guest speaker to be the person to cover that. So, and part of that's because I came into, like I mentioned, my background's in history. So I actually worked in libraries for years before I ever got the library degree. I kind of did it in reverse order. So by the time I did that, I pretty much knew quite a bit about IRs, probably more than most of the faculty did, just because they're not working with the IR on that level. I mean, they're certainly familiar with the IR. They've used the IR. In fact, they publish a journal through our IR. But in terms of like the nuts and bolts of running one, they wouldn't have had that experience. So that's usually why I get called in to do that bit of it.
That sounds like a fascinating challenge, and I think much needed because it strikes me that repositories are sort of a fundamental part of the library activity, and yet, as you say, so few people know much about them. And today, as much as when they started, people have sort of having to learn for themselves. So let's hope your book sort of plugs that gap a bit and provides a sort of a much needed introduction to the practice for people coming new to it. So I look forward to sort of to seeing what you come up with next, Josh, because I think it's a great initiative. So thanks very much for your time, and great to talk to you.
Sure. Absolutely. Thanks for having me.